Welcome to the Washington Monthly Show. I'm Paul Glastris, editor of the Washington Monthly. I'm here with my colleague and partner in crime, Ed Kilgore, out on the West Coast. Ed, has the rain stopped? Are you still getting mudslides? What's going on out in Monterey?
Well, we haven't had anything like that this far north in California. We got like 10 minutes of rain a week ago, and it may rain this week, but no, that's all down well south of here. Though some people think it's a prophecy of things to come, assuming we have an El Nino later in the fall or in the winter.
Still parched as can be?
Absolutely.
It's hard. Sorry to hear that. Well, when it rains, it pours.
Yep.
I won't ask you about football if you don't ask me about baseball. How's that?
Okay.
Though I'll confess, though I'm a National League guy, I think I'm going to lean to Kansas City. So Ed, we've got an odd moment now politically where there's just not a whole lot to talk about on the Democratic side, but a ton to talk about on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, what is there left to say? Hillary Clinton had a week or two of kind of an epic bounce back from where the CW thought she was 2 months ago. Give us a brief wrap up of what's happened with Hillary Clinton and the Democratic race for president and so forth.
Well, she just had a remarkable week. Joe Biden, who some people thought was an existential threat to Hillary's campaign and who clearly would have drawn from a lot of the same pool of voters and donors that she does, bowed out of the race rather conspicuously. Two of the minor candidates that were sort of a distraction also happened to withdraw. She had this, by virtually everybody's account, including most conservatives, a very strong performance in front of the Benghazi committee, which not only eliminated that as a potential threat to her public standing, but did a lot of damage to the whole, email story. And this was coming off of a very strong debate performance, and she's had some much better polling news in the last week or two, particularly in Iowa. So all in all, she is in a much stronger position than she was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it certainly solidified the feeling among most observers that it's very much her race to lose on the Democratic side. And frankly, she's really improved perceptions of her electability in the general election. So, yeah, she's had a pretty good couple of weeks. Not that Bernie Sanders is giving up or anything, but there's no question she's reestablished her positioning as the front runner.
Well said. And I think on the Republican side, the chaos continues, and we're going to have as our guest a master of following that chaos and describing it brilliantly, and that's Paul Waldman of the Washington Post's Plumb Line and The Week magazine, also the American Prospect. But as you look forward, Ed, all the action really is on the Republican side. And it seems to me there are 3 big events that we have to take stock of that are happening, and they're intertwined. The one is that we have the third Republican debate happening on Wednesday. The second is that Paul Ryan, at some point this week, I think maybe Thursday, will plans to be voted in as Speaker of the House. Of course, we've heard that before from Kevin McCarthy. That didn't happen, but I think the feeling is he probably will be voted in. And then the third is, and absolutely the least talked about, is that something has to happen. Legislation has to move to raise the debt ceiling pretty quickly. And I would suggest that there is an interaction between these 3 things, right?
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that the debate on Wednesday night will do much to determine who's going to win the nomination for president among the GOP, but it could hurt the chances of getting a debt limit increase if some of these candidates who are simultaneously sitting in the Senate, like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, draw some lines in the sand that change some votes. And I think everyone's looking at Paul Ryan and saying, well, an adult has finally taken over the class. Let's breathe a sigh of relief. He seems to have tamed the Freedom Caucus, and so we don't have to worry about this debt limit thing. That'll all get taken care of. But
yeah, right.
I think we're going to. I think there's some doubt about that.
Well, more generally, House Republicans are facing a series of potential crises that they could generate, the first being the debt limit, then in December, a renewed crisis over appropriations and, demands from the conservatives that Planned Parenthood be defunded or Obamacare be disabled or immigration executive orders be rescinded. And it just amazes me that in all the talk about Paul Ryan's negotiations with the House Freedom Caucus, there's absolutely no evidence that he made any concessions to them at all. He reaffirmed support for the Hastert rule, the unofficial principle that no legislation should be moved that a majority of House Republicans oppose. Yet violating the Hastert rule is precisely how John Boehner got around debt limit crises in the past, and it's also the way the federal government was reopened last time it shut down. So I don't know why there seems to be this strange sort of calm descending over Washington at the prospect of Paul Ryan assuming the Speaker's gavel. If he's got some sort of way around a debt limit vote that doesn't involve enlisting the support of Democrats, or indeed a way around these upcoming funding crises in December, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, and I think what you meant was that there's no evidence that the Freedom Caucus made any concessions to Ryan, that he seems to
I'm sorry
have
he made some to them.
Yeah, and I don't know that we know what those are, but they had this list of procedural demands that the New York Times and our own blogger Nancy Latourneau on the website kind of translated this weekend, and they're quite extraordinary. There are a series of demands to, for instance, punish any Republican lawmaker in the House who sides with the Democrats on any issue, but a promise that the leadership would never punish a Freedom Party member for shutting down the government or running, afoul of the leadership. So it really is, from what I can tell, if you look at the true meaning of what they're asking for, the prisons want the keys from the warden, and I don't know. It seems at the very least that Paul Ryan made a copy of the key and handed it to him.
Well, there's another dynamic that isn't getting attention too. On Friday, the House actually passed a budget reconciliation bill that would negate certain key elements of Obamacare and would also remove any appropriations for Planned Parenthood. And, this is a bill that will be vetoed by the president. There's just zero doubt about it whatsoever. That same bill, though, has run into trouble in the Senate because Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, the establishment candidate for president, I might add, are saying they can't support it because it doesn't go far enough in knocking down Obamacare. In other words, this is sort of the same kind of line the House Freedom Caucus is pushing, that the job of House Republicans is maximum confrontation with Democrats, even if the president can thwart them via a veto. And the best way I know to understand it is that this is a demonstration to House conservatives of what will happen if a Republican is elected president. And that's where the connection with the presidential nominating process comes up. A guy like Marco Rubio has every reason to prove to these people that he will be as crazy as they are if he's elected president. And I think that's why I think that in the debate itself, we could see some lines drawn in the sand, some litmus tests suggested, and some pledges made, by multiple candidates, thwarting what we are told the Republican establishment wants to happen in Congress. It's a very dangerous moment for the country. This is Ed Kilgore back with the Washington Monthly show, and due to technical difficulties, we've lost Paul Glastris. The good news is that we can now bring in Paul Waldman via Skype and interact with him visually as well as via audio. So we'll pick back up with Paul, your account, which you wrote about on Friday for the Plumb Line, of the mechanics of a debt limit increase and why that could be a real problem given the current composition of the House.
Yeah, well, there's a way that these crises used to proceed over the last few years, which was that the conservatives would make a lot of noise about how they had to stand up to the administration. And for a while, John Boehner would stick with them essentially and say, yes, we're gonna do that. We're gonna push this as far as we can go. We won't give in. But then eventually he would consent to hold a vote to either keep the government open or increase the debt limit. And that bill would pass with most or all of the Democrats and enough Republicans to get it over that 218. And that's how it happened again and again and again. So the question is, why is that less likely now? It's not just that Boehner is going to be passing this off to Paul Ryan. It's that the House is actually more conservative than it was in these previous crises. Because let's not forget that the Republicans won a big victory in 2014. And a lot of the people who got elected were people who are in that sort of Tea Party mode that we've seen since 2010. The Democrats there were some Democrats who lost, and so you've got more Republicans, and so you have a House that's even more conservative. And not only that, then you add to that the fact that they just got rid of Boehner, and so those people who are, you want to call them Tea Partiers or in the Freedom Caucus, they feel particularly emboldened. They feel like they just won that victory, and now they need to keep their streak going. And then you bring in the question of Paul Ryan, who presumably is going to be the next speaker. He has not talked yet about what he wants to do about raising the debt limit. Now, I would have to assume that it came up when he had those meetings with members of the Freedom Caucus to try to win their support. What did they ask him for? I think it would be hard to imagine that they would say, we'll give you a pass on that. Go ahead and stage the vote with, and you'll get enough with just Democrats and a few Republicans to pass it. The reporting that has come out has indicated that the Republicans don't even have 30 members who right now are willing to say that they'll vote for a debt limit increase. And that 30 is what you need because there are 188 Democrats. So it sure seems like we are heading toward a likely default on November 2nd or 3rd or whatever the current date that they are now saying we're going to need to increase the debt limit by.
Well, thank you for that. I'll add to your analysis that one of the things we did learn about the negotiations between Paul Ryan and the House Freedom Caucus is that he has reaffirmed his support for the Hastert rule, the informal principle that no legislation should come to the floor that a majority of Republicans oppose. By definition, all of these debt limit votes, and presumably the only one that could pass the House right now, involve a violation of the Hastert rule. So I agree with you. I don't quite see how this adds up. Now, there was some initial talk that maybe House conservatives would somehow let a debt limit bill go through quickly as sort of a going away present to John Boehner.
Right.
That this would not be Paul Ryan's problem. Do we have any real evidence of that, or is that just somebody's guess?
I haven't seen anything to suggest that they will do that. I mean, I think that's probably what Boehner wants. I mean, at the end of the day, in all these crises, he has been rather pragmatic, and he's certainly smart enough to know that it would be a disaster not just for the economy, but probably for his party. And so he may want to do that. But again, we're not even sure if he brought that up to a vote, if it would get enough votes to pass. So that's a real problem. And it may be that, where this will end up is that we'll actually have to have the default, at least for a while, before that the Hastert rule will be temporarily set aside. And maybe your memory is better than mine. I always seem to remember that Boehner would sort of pay lip service to the Hastert rule, but then in these kind of moments of crisis, he would say, "Okay, we're just gonna set it aside for the moment. We'll pass this bill. We'll keep the government open, and then when it comes to substantive legislation, we'll bring it back." And let's also consider what it is that the conservatives are demanding. They want to see cuts to Social Security, some kind of cuts to Medicare. Some of these are not really necessarily specified, but they're those are big dramatic policy changes that in their documents and things that they have asked for, and they know that there is no way that Barack Obama and the Democrats are going to say, okay, well, in exchange for avoiding a default, we'll start to chip away at these entitlement programs that are the cornerstones of the American social safety net. It's just not going to happen. But the conservatives, they have really built their whole political identities on the idea that success only comes when you stand up and fight, and you fight as long and as hard as possible. And there's one other thing I would say too. I think that for them, for this new generation of Republicans that have gotten elected since 2010, the fight is really what matters more than anything else. They have a policy agenda. They certainly do. They have things that they would like to see, but they've been defined by the fight and by fighting against their own party in particular. And so, they want to have these conflicts. They want to take these risks. They want to man the barricades. That's what is kind of defines their political identities. They're not people who, work their way up through the party, from the city council to the state legislature to finally to Congress, and we're sort of schooled in the deal making that you have to do to get things through. That's not where they came from. They're people who for whom the combat is really the whole point of the exercise.
Now, if you ask these people about that, they're probably not going to admit that. They will start talking about the long history of betrayal of the cause, the wholly conservative cause by the Republican establishment over the years. And, so the essential message that the Republican establishment is trying to get to these folks is wait a year and a half, wait till after 2006. If you behave yourselves, perhaps we can win the trifecta in 2016. We will have a Republican in the White House, and then you're going to get absolutely everything you want.
And that's a good argument.
It's a good argument because something that I think the mainstream media misses a lot is that the Republican establishment actually agrees with the Freedom Caucus on a lot of the substantive issues. They want to kill Planned Parenthood, kill it dead. They want to criminalize abortion. They want to repeal Obamacare almost completely. They want to reverse Barack Obama's executive actions on immigration and climate change. There's not really much of an ideological disagreement. It's all about trust, timing, and conflict. And what kind of scares me a little bit, though, about the context is that it certainly creates an incentive for Republican presidential candidates to demonstrate, I'm the guy you can trust to give you what you want. Because it creates an enormous incentive for these candidates to side with the hardliners in these very dangerous conflicts. For example, Marco Rubio, as I think I mentioned earlier, is cheek by jowl with Ted Cruz in demanding a reconciliation bill that completely root and branch repeals Obamacare. So the conjunction of the presidential nominating contest with these conflicts in Congress, in my mind, makes this even more dangerous. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's pressure coming from all different directions pushing toward a default. So not only are the presidential candidates being pressured by Congress to take those kinds of that extreme position, but then once they do, that then puts pressure back on Congress. There was an interesting article in the Washington Post on Monday about how even some of these most extreme Tea Party members are feeling just for suggesting that they would consent to having Paul Ryan be the Speaker of the House. They got all kinds of all kinds of flack on Facebook and phone calls and things like that from their constituents saying, you've betrayed the cause. And these are the guys who are the hardest of hardliners. And then you have things like conservative talk radio, where this whole theme of who's betraying who and who's fighting hard enough against the establishment, hosts like Mark Levin and Laura Ingraham, they're putting pressure on Congress to push toward default. So you have all these different forces that are all pushing everybody in the same way. And the only thing on the other side is, as you said, members of that establishment saying, look, if let's just not try to screw this presidential thing up, because if we can get a president elected, then, as you said, we can have everything. We can outlaw abortion after 20 weeks. We can have big tax cuts. There's nothing they won't be able to do if they get control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. So from a logical standpoint, you think they would say, okay, well, we're just going to sort of lay low. And the best thing for us Republicans to do in Congress is just not to make life any more complicated for our eventual Republican presidential nominee. And this is the kind of thing that will make life more complicated. But with them under all this pressure from so many different directions, all pushing in the same direction, it's hard to see how we avoid a default.
Well, default aside, both the debt limit legislation and appropriations are simply alternative vehicles for an agenda, a policy agenda that cannot be enacted so long as Barack Obama's in the White House, and in many cases, so long as the filibuster is available to Democratic senators. So another part of this problem, another bit of the pressure that you're I think very rightly talking about, is emanating from the presidential campaign itself, and the sort of passions it arouses. If, for example, you believe, as Ben Carson clearly does, that legalized abortion is exactly what the Nazis were doing, it's a Holocaust, it's an American Holocaust, you're going to be a little unreasonable about federal funding for Planned Parenthood, aren't you? If you really believe that Obamacare is, to quote Ben Carson, who currently leads the polls in Iowa, the worst thing to happen since slavery, then you're not going to muck around much with allowing elements of it to stay in force, right? You're going to use whatever leverage you have to kill it right away. So, a lot of this really does involve a dysfunctional dialogue between the Republican Party and its own activists, in which extremist sentiments have been stirred up within authority.
Yeah, and that whole cycle has been going on for years.
Yes.
Where the politicians come out and make unreasonable promises, and they say, if you give us a big win in this coming off your election, we will get rid of Obamacare. Yeah. And of course they can't, because the president's still in the White House and he still has the veto pen. And then what happens? Well, after the election, they do win, but they don't get rid of Obamacare. None of the substantive things they said they were going to be able to do get done. And then the constituents say, well, what just happened? You told us that if we came out and voted that you would achieve all these substantive goals, but you haven't. And so then they get a whole bunch of candidates from the right challenging their members in primaries, and they're saying, they betrayed you. They said they were going to do these things and they didn't. So vote for me. And then the cycle just kind of continues itself. And you don't have anybody who's willing to say to those constituents, look, we've been telling you were going to get stuff you weren't going to be able to get. But if we elect a president, that's when we will get these things. But between now and then, it's just not going to happen. So we should stop pretending that it will if we just stand up and fight. But nobody it's like there's this beast that they created, and now they don't know what to do with it. It's like they created this fierce constituency to fight Barack Obama, but then it turned on themselves, and now they don't know what to do.
So, do you think there's any remote chance that we've got a presidential debate, as we mentioned earlier, coming up on Wednesday, the third one, from Denver, sponsored by CNBC, which is supposed to focus on economic and fiscal issues, by the way. You think there's any chance that a John Kasich or some other candidate will stand up and say exactly that?
There's always a chance.
We just need to be patient and put me in the White House and I'll do all these wonderful things conservatives want. And if you nominate some of these people that want to fight all the time, we're going to lose.
Yeah, I think there's certainly room for somebody to say that.
It hasn't happened so far, has it?
No. But the question then is, what's the response when they do? Somebody can sort of break out in a debate, and sometimes, like we saw with Carly Fiorina, she had this very dramatic moment talking about abortion, and it got a lot of attention, and she got a little bump in her amount of media coverage and a little bump in the polls, but then it went back, and now she's back at around 5%. It's possible for somebody to come out and say that and sort of be courageous and take that risk. But then the question is, do the voters say, you know what, that really makes a lot of sense, I'm going to maybe support this guy? Or do they just reject it when the next person down the line says, no, we have to stand up and fight?
Well, that's a very good question. But I mean, I think you agree with me that the ongoing pressure in the Republican Party to move to the right that we've been seeing now for, some would argue many decades, some would argue a few years, hasn't abated. And so far, there's just not any percentage in coming out and saying, I'm the moderate in this field. The one person who's even recently done that, John Huntsman in 2012, sank like a stone. But it's fascinating to see this huge opportunity open up for Republican realism, and maybe nobody will take it. What are you looking forward to in this debate on Wednesday night? I hope you're not as foolish as I am. I've already sort of agreed in advance to live blog it. But what would you look for in this debate?
Well, I guess that's one question, is how are they going to talk about what's going on in Congress right now? Because, it's been a busy couple of weeks, and I don't think there has been as much attention paid to this upcoming debt limit question as there should have been. But, because we had the Hillary Clinton testimony and all kinds of other things going on. Especially if they're going to be talking about fiscal matters, I mean, that's a really key question. And it would be really interesting to see if somebody would stand up and sort of make that plea for realism, and maybe if they could do it in a way that doesn't sound like they're saying I'm the moderate, because right now there's no margin in that, and especially with Jeb Bush continuing to flounder. Now if you look at the smart money, it's all on Marco Rubio being the next person whom the establishment is going to turn to. But of course, he's no moderate. He's just as conservative as any of the other candidates. So I don't know. There's always the potential for some kind of a surprise, somebody who's going to be able to do something different and stand out like that. But the question is then, can you turn that into something really meaningful? And right now, you have 50% of the Republican electorate that's supporting either Donald Trump or Ben Carson. And they're the two people who, frankly, know the least and have the least interest in any kind of substantive policy questions. But so far, that hasn't hurt either one of them. Trump is still leading, and he dismisses any kind of substantive question. Yeah, it's going to be terrific. And Ben Carson, too, just seems to have no interest in any kind of meaningful policy question at all, and takes these extraordinarily radical stands on a whole range of things, but it only seems to help him. All the people who are voting for him talk about what a gentle manner he has, which is true, but he also takes some positions that are pretty out there. So I don't know. It's hard to predict whether there might be something sort of interesting and surprising. But I think that if they're going to be talking about the economy, that's one thing that they should have to address, is what we ought to do about the immediate problem that we're facing coming up in the next couple of weeks. And then, given that they all share sort of a basic economic approach of cutting taxes, cutting regulations, it'd be interesting to see if they really got challenged on that, with the basic problem of that, which is not just the political problem that, they're going to get pilloried by Democrats for wanting to cut taxes for rich people, which is what always happens, and it usually works. But the other basic question is, to me, is, we've had a record in the last few decades of what happens when you cut taxes and decrease regulations, and it doesn't produce the kind of economic nirvana that Republicans always say it will. And the flip side of that coin is, whenever a Democrat proposes to raise taxes, they say, oh, you're going to be plunged into a job-killing recession. That doesn't happen either. Democrats generally have a better record on the economy than Republicans do. But the real question is, we're at a point right now where the simple questions and answers that we've asked about the economy don't seem to be enough anymore. It's not just about can we create jobs or can we create a growth rate over 3%. We have extremely positive job creation right now and have had for a couple of years, but yet people still feel insecure. They feel like they aren't getting out of their workplaces what they want. They don't feel like they're treated well. And so you have this kind of fundamental insecurity, and the traditional answers about like, oh, well, if we cut taxes, we'll grow more. That doesn't really answer the questions that are really gripping people's lives and making them feel like this economy isn't what it should be. So I'd like to hear some discussion about that, about what more do we need to do for people other than just creating growth and creating jobs, because we're creating jobs right now, but nobody is saying that this economy is spectacular. I don't know if they have any answers to that, but I'd like to hear them discuss it about something with a little more depth to the economy than what's the rate of growth and how many jobs did we create last month.
Well, you'll around the margins you'll hear Rick Santorum, talk about his own sort of prescriptions for reviving middle class wage growth. I don't think they're terribly credible, but he is talking about it. So is Mike Huckabee now and then, and Donald Trump, has this sort of rap of everything good about America is going to be magnified in the Trump administration. Growth, wage growth, even private sector unions will flourish. So he has sort of an eccentric, supersizing message there. But I think what we're more likely to see on Wednesday night are some fault lines develop. I don't know how they're going to talk very much about the economy and the federal budget or even the debt limit and conditions on the debt limit without getting into this very perilous subject of entitlement reform, which is very much part of the orthodox Republican economic and fiscal package. It's code, of course, for fundamental changes in Social Security and Medicare and maybe Medicaid. And as we've seen, or anybody that's paid attention to polls for years knows, rank and file Republicans don't agree with it.
Yeah.
Particularly the kind of non-college educated white working class voters that Donald Trump has been attracting. Trump is already on record opposing any cuts in Medicare and Social Security, as is Mike Huckabee, by the way. Yet Jeb Bush, Freudian slip. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, several other, Ted Cruz have budget proposals that sort of assume big changes in these programs. And then you have Ben Carson, who's on record favoring elimination of Medicare and Medicaid in favor of very large health savings accounts. That is, some people think that, not his crazy views on, guns or abortion or anything like that, is what could kill off a Ben Carson candidacy, too sweet. Is it possible this stuff is all going to come up and create some pretty serious fault lines within the Republican coalition or exacerbate some that are already there?
Yeah, it could. And, the interesting thing about Trump is that because his is a campaign of personality, he's kind of liberated from Republican orthodoxy on those things. So if he wants to say, that we should keep Medicare around and Social Security, he can do that. He can even say a couple positive things about single-payer healthcare in other countries, and it doesn't really matter very much because the people who are supporting him are not doing it because he's some kind of down-the-line conservative. And that's what's so interesting about, periodically you read articles from sort of deep in the Republican establishment about how they're going to, initiate some new campaign against Trump. And one of their main messages is that he's not a real conservative. He's not a true conservative. And the people who are supporting him, they don't care. That's not why they're not supporting him because he's the most conservative one. They're supporting him because he's Donald Trump. So that does create that kind of fault line. And the sort of more traditional politicians are the ones who will follow what is kind of the party consensus on this. And I think that idea is something that's important to understand when you have these big policy debates, is that presidential candidates, especially the successful ones, they end up kind of just sort of gravitating toward whatever it is that the party has arrived at a consensus on. And so, for instance, when in 2008, when all the candidates on the Democratic side were proposing health care plans, they all were basically the same because that was where the party consensus had arrived after Bill Clinton failed to reform health care. Was that, we need a system that's basically private, but provides something for people who don't have insurance and gives people subsidies. And so the differences between Hillary Clinton's plan and Barack Obama's plan and John Edwards' plan were really small because they were all just part of that party consensus. And right now in the Republican Party, the consensus is probably something like Paul Ryan's plan for Medicare, which is that we should transition it away from a single-payer government healthcare program like it is now to some kind of voucher program. They call it premium supported, not vouchers, but there's really no
something like Obamacare. Ironically,
exactly, something like Obamacare. And so that's really where the party consensus is. And of course, they say, well, we're strengthening Medicare, and for the people who have it now, we're not going to touch it. Which is kind of ironic because if it's so terrific for the people who have it now, why do we want to change it for everybody else? Right. But that's that's where the party's consensus is, that we need to, if they can, and they've tried and failed over and over, but if they can, they would like to transition it into some kind of a voucher program like that. But then you have candidates come along like Trump or Ben Carson who aren't necessarily so wedded to that party consensus because they just became politicians a few months ago. And so Carson can say something radically outside that party consensus, like, we should just get rid of it entirely and put it on health savings accounts, which, as an aside, is an absolutely insane idea. And it's also kind of ironic that one of the two doctors in the race has the craziest plan for what to do about Medicare.
I've been having a lot of trouble with Carson because I really don't temperamentally like calling people crazy. And yet, in his case, less strident words sometimes seem to miss the whole point. It's not simply that he takes outlandish, outside-the-box positions on things like Medicare and Medicaid. He's also subscribes to some of the hoariest, ancient John Birch Society-generated conspiracy theories about the basic nature of politics and the country. Yet this man, his approval ratios among Republican voters right now are unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. They're almost unanimous. They all love him. So you have to figure if you're in one of these other candidate camps, you're probably reaching one of two or three conclusions. One is, well, he's this year's Herman Cain. He'll fade on his own. Or two, I'm afraid to attack him because he's so popular. So, certainly a debate in which you have to discuss the future of Medicare and Medicaid. I don't know how he's going to get around articulating this particularly politically dangerous point of view. I'd also mention that it's hard to imagine a economic/fiscal debate in which the Trans-Pacific Partnership does not come up, which is another element of consensus Republican Party orthodoxy to which several candidates, notably Donald Trump, do not subscribe. And I think there's a more than a decent chance that he will bring this up and distinguish himself from the rest of the party. And polls generally show that I'd say at least half of Republican rank and file are not crazy about big trade agreements like this.
Yeah. And again, he has the liberty to do that because he's kind of unmoored from all those debates that have gone on within the party for a long time, and any need to feel like he's got to be consistent in order to get votes. So, and frankly, opposition to trade deals fits perfectly within his particular brand of populism. Because he can come out and say, we're going to kick the Chinese ass, we're going to kick the Mexicans ass, and and everything will work out great.
Yeah.
And once I get across the table from them, and so I think the people who support him that's a message that they want to hear. It provides an explanation of at least part of the reason why manufacturing jobs have left the United States over the last few decades. And so, if he comes out and says that stuff like that is the problem, that we've been getting our butts kicked by these other countries, and it nicely combines a kind of populism, a sort of jingoism. There's a whole lot of things about it. And to come back and say, well, economists agree that free trade is a net positive. That's not as compelling an argument as Trump getting up there and saying that, we're going to go and get our jobs back from China.
Well, the big picture here, we probably need to wrap it up shortly, but the big picture here is that the expert consensus is that neither Donald Trump nor Ben Carson can win the Republican presidential nomination. Right now, they're currently getting half the vote. There are really no signs of any other candidates emerging. This is sort of theory that Marco Rubio should emerge is the establishment alternative to Trump and Carson. But as you know, there are no objective signs of it yet. He's not getting a lot of support in the horse race polls. He doesn't have a ton of money. There's no obvious place he's going to win. He still has to beat Jeb Bush in a one-on-one fight in a winner-take-all primary in his own state of Florida. So it's I've never seen anything quite like it, with the possible exception of the 2008 Republican nominating contest, where by what I can only describe as a demolition derby, John McCain somehow got the nomination, even though a big majority of Republicans didn't want him to have it. Are you willing to make any prophecies yet of what this is ultimately going to produce?
Well, every time I make one, it seems that it doesn't turn out to be true. And you're right. I mean, I think this is the race that has so far just upended all those things we thought it was how it was supposed to work. Usually in the Republican race, you get someone who's sort of the establishment choice, and then eventually some rebel comes along and challenges him, and it plays out, and eventually the establishment person is the one who ends up winning. And that's the way it happened with Mitt Romney, and you could argue, but didn't quite follow the script with McCain, but everybody else, that's usually the way the race goes. But the establishment choice at the beginning, Jeb Bush is doing horribly. I mean, he's not dead yet, but the vultures are circling, and as you say, Rubio is the person who the sort of smart money is on, but it hasn't expressed itself in the polls yet. There's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why he really should be the one who emerges, but so far nobody seems to have clued the Republican voters in on that, and Trump was supposed to flame out a long time ago. And somebody like Ben Carson was supposed to be like a Herman Cain or a Michelle Bachmann, who would have, like 2 weeks of time in the sun and then disappear. But he seems much stronger, and he's only getting stronger all the time. And so this race is so complicated. And I think a lot of it is because it comes at the tail end of 8 years of a Democratic administration with so many kind of just venomous arguments within the Republican Party. That's what's making this so complicated, is that the desire to win is intense, and so much of the anger within the Republican electorate is directed not at the other party, but at their own leaders. And so this narrative of betrayal and the Republicans in Washington being ineffectual and overpromising, that is having a tremendous hold on the Republican electorate. And so far the candidates who you think would end up winning haven't been able to kind of navigate their way around that.
Yeah, well, just in time for Halloween, this is a scary scenario to people left of center for ideological reasons, and to the right of center for electability reasons. So it will be interesting to see if there's any sense of return to normalcy in and after this next debate. Because so far, as you said, it's been entirely counterintuitive. And let's also remember that pretty soon we're going to be into the holiday season, in which an awful lot of voters begin to tune out, and then we're going to start voting pretty soon.
Yes, eventually votes will actually be cast.
Yes, and I make fun of a lot of political scientists in particular who basically argue that voters are irrelevant in nomination processes, that the elites make the call and then tell the voters who to vote for. And I understand their point of view and the evidence for that, but this cycle could be the acid test, at least among Republicans, in which I think there is a tangible desire to prove the elites wrong, and that could be very dangerous for their party, but ultimately for the country too. Well, we'll see what happens on Wednesday night. I hope you're able to watch it with a sense of detachment while us poor idiots live blog it. But we'll find out soon. It's been great to have you on this show, Paul. Hope we can do it again.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
So long.